Looking at it right now. Pierre, what do you know?
David, we have the specific charges. United States of America versus Donald Trump. Conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Obstruction and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. We're going to be looking through this specifically, but basically this case is a speaking indictment laying out a case that Donald Trump was very clear that he lost the election and then proceeded to try to take the election from the American public. That's the generic case. We'll just have to read through the specifics and how they lay out the specifics, but it will be a speaking indictment laying out the case that Donald Trump was aware that he lost. There was no wide-scale fraud. He was clear on that and then took steps to stop the certification of Joe Biden as president of the United States.
And just for people watching our live coverage right now, Donald Trump now a second federal criminal indictment from the special counsel Jack Smith. Many in the legal world, Dan Abrams included, have said that if there was an indictment in this case, that this is even far more serious than the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And perhaps one of the reasons why, Pierre, you just lasered in on this notion that the former president knew that he lost the election, according to Jack Smith and federal prosecutors. That's the psychological component here, that he knew and yet continued to move forward with strategy to somehow hold on to the White House.
And David, we have to be careful until we read the specifics. But to be clear here, they're suggesting that the president of the United States, Donald Trump, in office, was using the power of the presidency to retain power, to basically block the peaceful transfer of power. This is something that Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, talked about over and over again, that they would hold anyone accountable who attempted to unlawfully block the peaceful transfer of power.
I want to bring in Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst. Dan, when you hear these charges, 4 counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, and deprivation of rights, the right to vote, that your vote would count. Yep. These are very serious charges.
Yeah, and now we have some detail as we read through this indictment in real time here. A conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. That is the one, the defrauding of the United States, a conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified. That is another account, a conspiracy against the right to vote and have one's vote counted. That's more of a catch-all one, where it's been used a number of times in the 20th century, which is interesting that it's about voter fraud. It's about basically saying, you know, in other cases where people were stuffing ballots, et cetera, and saying that deprived everyone else of the right to have the votes counted fairly. And that is now something that Donald Trump is being charged with in this indictment, which is one of the big picture pockets that we have to look at here.
And David, can I add one thing here? They're clearly stating that the fake electors, this attempt to bring in fake electors, was part of a plan to defraud the American public with false statements to make them think that Trump, in fact, had won when he had lost.
Pierre, I want to read this for our viewers watching this. This is the indictment just in, and again, you heard Dan there list briefly what these 4 counts would be after an initial readout from Pierre. But I just want to read the beginning of this speaking indictment. You heard Pierre reference that. We have seen this before from Jack Smith. It's what they call, in essence, a speaking indictment means to lay out in lay terms so that the rest of us and viewers, voters across this country could, in essence, understand why Jack Smith and his team are taking this action. Carefully laid out here for people at home even to read. 45 pages. I'm not going to read it all, but I will read the very beginning. It says the defendant, Donald J. Trump, was the 45th president of the United States and a candidate for re-election in 2020. The defendant lost the 2020 presidential election. Despite having lost, Jack Smith says, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew that they were false. John Carl, that is a significant part of Jack Smith's argument, and it goes to some of what the January 6th committee put before the American people, some of what you have reported, the psychology of the former president, and those in his inner circle who testified before the American people that this was a president who knew he lost.
I mean, we remember the January 6th committee was almost entirely hearing from Republicans, and many of those Republicans, people close to Donald Trump, who testified over and over again that they told him that the election was over and that he had lost. David, I had a very senior Republican in that Congress tell me just about a week or so after the election, he is a man who knows he lost, and it is hard on him. But I want to tell you, there are also 6 co-conspirators that are listed in this. They're not named, but they are described. 4 of them are lawyers. 1 of them is a Justice Department official, and another is a political consultant, all being described as helping him to implement this scheme. And this, again, this is not just about the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. This is about a coordinated, comprehensive effort led by the President of the United States to overturn an election that he knew he lost.
Let me just take this one step further, Dan, and then I'll bring it to you, because Jack Smith lays this out very carefully. I had mentioned that in this indictment, he says the defendant knew that these claims were false, but the defendant repeatedly and widely disseminated them anyway to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election, Dan.
I was just going to say, the indictment goes state by state and basically talks about exactly what Donald Trump did and said, because that's the key, right? I mean, you can make an allegation about the fake electors, right, and say these people, for example, some of them have been charged in Michigan for their conduct, but you still have to show Donald Trump's role in this, that he knew what he was doing and that he was actually taking actions in connection with this. And the indictment goes through point by point about the calls he was making, calling the leaders in Arizona, calling leaders in Michigan, et cetera. And that's the key here, is to be looking for Donald Trump himself's actions, not just the broader. We've known for a long time about the issue of these electors. The question's always been exactly what did Donald Trump do?
They said, they actually make the point, though, in this indictment, and I want to add here that the defendant, Donald Trump, had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election that he had won. He can claim that, they say. He's entitled to formally challenge the results of the election lawfully through appropriate means. But they go on to say, indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods, I should say, of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly unsuccessful. And in many cases, John, as we reported on numerous occasions, these were Republican-appointed judges who said, there's nothing here.
Most of them, some of them appointed by Trump himself. But what is significant here also is it outlines who told Trump that what he was doing and what he was saying was untrue. And it's pretty comprehensive. We've known some of this, but they go through the defendant's vice president. By the way, the role of Vice President Pence is critical in this indictment. The pressure that Trump put on Pence to use his power in presiding over the certification of those ballots on January 6th is critical here. But the vice president told him it was wrong. Senior Justice Department officials that he had appointed to the Justice Department told him that the election was not stolen. The Department of Homeland Security, senior White House attorneys, senior staffers on his own re-election campaign, state legislatures and officials, almost all of them Republicans, told him, no, the election was not stolen. The results are certified. We have no power to overturn it. And he continued to persist in pressuring them to use their positions to overturn an election that was over.
Yeah, an extraordinary list of names and figures very close to the former president who repeatedly told him that he had lost the election. We know that Mike Pence, the former vice president, sitting across from me, I point blank said, did you tell the president he lost? We lost here. And he said on numerous occasions, I made that very clear to the former president. I want to bring in Aaron Kotursky because this, as we said before, this speaking indictment goes into state by state here. One of the states it talks about is Georgia, and according to Jack Smith, and it's been reported out publicly, the intense pressure on elections officials in Georgia to find the votes, a state that Joe Biden won. We do have a piece of the audio of former President Donald Trump, that key telephone call that has been heard by the American people before, but that will play a role in this case. Let's listen to that audio, and then I'll bring in Aaron.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
11,780 votes. I just want to find those votes. Let's bring in Aaron Katersky. And Aaron, this indictment speaks to Georgia as well.
In fact, it includes a transcript of that very phone call that former President Trump made to Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, and it goes into detail about other things that the former president said to him, including claiming that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia, and Raffensperger's response saying, well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. And the American people heard much of this during the course of the January 6th committee hearings up on Capitol Hill, just a few blocks from where I'm standing now. There's also Arizona, what happened in Arizona, where Trump, according to the indictment, and co-conspirator one, who sounds an awful lot like Rudy Giuliani, asserted, among other things, that non-citizens, non-residents, and dead people had fraudulently voted in Arizona. All part, David, of what this 45-page indictment calls a criminal scheme to overturn an election that the former president knew he lost.
It talks about the conspiracy, this scheme. Aaron, thank you. Aaron Katersky, our investigative reporter. It did say in this indictment, in terms of the conspiracy, from November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th of 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. John Carl, I want to bring you in on what you found here in the indictment as well.
Well, again, going state by state by state. So we know the Georgia case. We've covered it so much. We've heard that phone call over again. We know what happened in Arizona, where the Republican Speaker of the House, Rusty Bowers, actually had meetings with Rudy Giuliani and asked Rudy Giuliani, where is the evidence that the election was stolen? Cited in this indictment is the famous line from Rusty Bowers, we have theories, we don't have evidence. But it's also interesting to look at Michigan. One of the things that we heard Donald Trump say over and over again was that there were votes that came in, ballot dumps of illegal votes that came in late in the night that overturned the election results in Michigan. This is something that he still repeats. And it points out that the Attorney General at the time, Bill Barr, told one of the co-defendants in this case and Trump himself in a very famous meeting, no, there was nothing irregular about what happened with how the votes came in Michigan. So it goes over, frankly, David, a lot of material that we've heard before. I mean, much of this played out in the January 6th committee. Much of this has been reported out. We've done a lot of it here on ABC News. But it is bringing together the evidence that Trump not only was lying about what happened in these states, but that he knew he was lying because he had been told by people who were very close to him, who had investigated in it, his allegations, and told him that they were not true.
John Carl with us here at the desk, along with Pierre Thomas, Mary Bruce, Stan Abrams. It's about 14 minutes before 6 o'clock now. We've been told that the special counsel himself, Jack Smith, will be addressing the American people. We know from the past he does not come before the camera very often. The only other time, in fact, that we saw him was after the federal criminal indictment involving the classified documents case. Again, we will hear from him today, now just a matter of minutes after the indictment has been unsealed, more quickly than we saw him last time, though. If last time indicates what we will see this time, it will be brief, very forward. But again, what he tried to do was encourage the American people last time to read the indictment. My guess is, and we'll wait and listen to Jack Smith here momentarily, that he will try to make that case again, to read through it for yourself. That he and the team have presented what they've called a speaking indictment to explain in very clear detail in 45 pages here why they've moved ahead with what many legal observers believe is a far more serious criminal indictment than even the classified documents case. This case involves a presidential election, alleged attempts to obstruct the federal government and proceedings of a presidential election, confirming them, and as Dan Abrams pointed out, that catch-all, the right to vote. Getting in the way of an American citizen's right to vote is one of the 4 counts here, basically, from Jack Smith. And one thing I want to make sure that we point out to folks at home watching this, it's not just Jack Smith versus Donald J. Trump here. These are grand juries that have looked at the evidence and said there is enough here.
Right. I mean, look, people often say that a grand jury is a very low standard. That's true. But it is still a grand jury of citizens who've decided that there is enough evidence on each of the specific charges to move forward with a trial. Ultimately, of course, it'll be a regular jury that determines guilt or innocence in a case like this. But they have used this grand jury both to subpoena witnesses, right? When you get a grand jury, you get the power to subpoena. People can't just say, I'm not going to show up, as might be the case in another venue. When it comes to a criminal case in a grand jury and you get subpoenaed, you got to show up. So they've had the opportunity to gather a little bit more evidence in connection with this than maybe even the January 6th Commission, which we should point out, the January 6th Committee wanted additional charges that Jack Smith, and as a special counsel, did not pursue. For example, an insurrection charge. That's not here. That would have been the most serious charge imaginable, and the special counsel decided not to pursue that as a charge in the criminal case.
It's very interesting because the special counsel, Jack Smith, does bring up January 6th, the day itself, the attack. I want to bring back in Aaron Katursky to the conversation because, Aaron, you lasered in the indictment where they talk about the violence of that day.
In fact, the special counsel's indictment says that former President Trump exploited the violence and the chaos at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And the indictment begins this section talking about his speech at the Ellipse before all that chaos broke out, quoting him directly, David, where he says, we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And it goes on to list the former president's actions that day as people were breaking through barriers that were cordoning off the Capitol grounds, advancing on the building, violently attacking law enforcement officers, and taking aim, the indictment does, David, at the former president's decision not to try and stop it. And in this particular section, former President Trump joins more than 1,000 other defendants who have been directly charged for various crimes because of their role on January 6th in breaking into the Capitol, in ransacking the building, in attacking some of the police officers. And for a long time, there were questions about the person who may have fomented all of this. Was he ever going to be charged? And now Special Counsel Jack Smith in this indictment has provided an answer, even though a specific insurrection charge is not there.
Fascinating. Aaron Katursky with us. The references to what played out on January 6th, although the actual charge of inciting an insurrection is not part of this count. This is something that the January 6th committee heard an awful lot from them about the potential to charge on that. Jack Smith deciding not to, though obviously as part of this indictment against the president goes into what played out on January 6th. A big question going into today involving this federal criminal indictment. This is something that the former president had suggested was coming and soon himself after that target letter several days back. Jack Smith and his team characteristically very quiet in recent days, though now we have the indictment. And a question about this impending indictment would be whether or not they would directly connect the former president to any of this scheme involving fake electors, to put fake electors in place from key battleground states around the country and send them to Washington instead to try to overturn the election, to keep the White House for Donald Trump. And John Carl, you have found part of the indictment where they connected to Donald Trump.
Directly to Trump. And the reason why this is really important here, Smith outlines that, every state sent certified electors to Congress to be counted. They organized this scheme to send alternative electors that claimed Trump had won in these states. And Smith points out this was to create a controversy at the certification proceeding January 6th and position the vice president presiding as the president of the Senate over that proceeding to supplant legitimate electors with the defendant's fake electors and to certify an election the opposite way. So what this says is that this scheme began by one of the co-defendants who contacted the chief of staff, that would be Mark Meadows, and Mark Meadows said, okay, we'll get on this. And then Trump heard about it, was very interested in this, and convened a call between Donald Trump and the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, Ronna McDaniel. And what it says is the defendant and co-conspirator called the chairwoman, Republican National Committee, to ensure the plan was in motion. During the call, the co-conspirator told the chairwoman that it was important that the RNC help the defendant's campaign gather these fake electors in the targeted states, and falsely represented to her that the electors' votes would only be used in litigation. So they kind of fooled the chairwoman of the RNC as to why they wanted to do it. But Trump is on this call and directly involved in pursuing this scheme.
And again, that's significant because there were a lot of questions about whether or not Donald Trump would be directly linked to any part of this strategy.
We've seen the fake certificates. We knew that some members of his legal team were involved in gathering those names, but we hadn't seen Donald Trump directly tied to this, and this puts him right at the heart of it.
Again, we're about 5 to 6 minutes away from hearing from Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case. I want to bring back in Pierre Thomas.
David, I'm struck by how the special counsel is directly making the claim that Donald Trump was a criminal president. Quote, he widely disseminated false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew in many cases and had been informed directly that they were not true. One of the cases that they use is particularly, I think, specific and jarring. It said that President Trump asserted in the state of Pennsylvania that there had been more than 205,000 more votes in that state. The state attorney general told the president that that was not true, and he kept putting forth that lie. So they're making the case that time and time again, the people in a position to know that these claims were untrue were telling the president, no, your information is wrong. And I have from additional sources, people were telling him at every turn, you're wrong, Mr. President. The information you're getting is wrong. And Jack Smith is making the case over and over again that the president knew he was wrong and kept putting forth the lie.
What Jack Smith is saying is sowing chaos, confusion that then led to the events that we witnessed here as a country.
And David, he's proving to be one of the more aggressive prosecutors I've seen in more than 20 years of covering the Justice Department. This notion of taking on a former president and basically coming to the conclusion that he was acting criminally, and now making that case before a grand jury, and now he's going to make the case to the American public. I think you'll hear the words, something to the effect that no one's above the law and that this had to be pursued.
Important to remember that Jack Smith also tried war crimes at The Hague not long ago.
Exactly. Again, he'll have to prove it in court. We don't know if he'll get any kind of conviction in these cases, but clearly he's a person unconcerned about the politics, unconcerned about the outside noise. He's going after the former president.
Precisely my point of bringing that up. A no-nonsense prosecutor in this case.
One other interesting point about a possible defense here, right, is that unlike in the documents case, where it's a pretty straightforward case, right? Either he knew he had these documents and he was obstructing the investigation, or he wasn't. There could be a more complex defense, meaning I expect that he, if this case goes to trial, would say something to the effect of, I was relying on advice and counsel I was getting from other people. Yes, it's true. Someone said to me that it didn't happen. Someone else said they didn't believe it. But you know what? There were still other people who told me it was true. And when I heard it was true, I said, I got to do something about this. I'm going to go forward and try and fix this. That's the sort of defense you could get here. He puts it on the lawyers, says on the legal side, they told me that this was a completely legitimate way to move forward, some of the co-conspirators, by the way. And then on the factual side, saying, I had people telling me that there were problems in each of these states, even though others were saying it's not true.
And how would he defend the allegation that he's on the phone with the head of the RNC saying we should move forward this fake elector scheme?
Right. In his view, it's alternate electors. Right? In his view, it's not fake electors, the alternate electors. Look, and by the way, in some of the states, they didn't go as far as in others. In some of the states, they actually had language in their documents that said, in the event that there is a dispute when the electors are being certified, then we are the alternate electors. That's not really as big a legal problem as saying we are the electors. We are the legitimate electors. Those are the ones that are the bigger problem than saying, in the event that there's a dispute, we would be the ones. And that's a critical difference.
And how significant is at this point that they have connected, Jack Smith has connected Donald Trump to Ronna McDaniel in one of these phone calls directly?
Critical. I mean, and actually, the very beginning of the paragraph that Jonathan read, as the defendant's attempts to obstruct the electoral vote through deceit of state officials met with repeated failure, beginning in early December 2020, he and co-conspirators developed a new plan to marshal individuals who would serve as the defendant's electors. He and others, right? So he's part of the plan here. And that's the critical point. That's why Jonathan is right, that the thing I was looking for was, how are they going to specifically link Donald Trump and the call with the RNC, the specific calls that he's making, some of which we knew about, to state officials? Those become critical pieces of evidence.
And he's
Dan
constantly
Abrams.
being asked, he's asking to be updated on the progress of the plan of getting these fake electors together. And at one point, they're asking a campaign official to put out a statement about it. And the campaign official is saying, oh, you know, how am I going to do this? This is illegal electors. So clearly people on his team knew that this was not only not true, but illegal.
You're looking at live pictures right now. We're expecting to hear in Washington from the special counsel, Jack Smith. Again, it was just about a half an hour ago that we learned of now a second federal criminal indictment. This one with 4 counts naming only the former president, Donald J. Trump, in this indictment, though conspirators, there are references to several co-conspirators. The only person named, though, in the charges, the actual counts in this federal indictment, the former president himself. It's 45 pages long. Again, it's what we call a speaking indictment, purposefully written in terms that the American people, that voters across this country can read it and understand the actions Jack Smith and his team. We're expecting to hear from Jack Smith. We've been told about 6 o'clock Eastern time. We'll keep an eye on that camera. In the meantime, as we await Jack Smith, we have learned at this hour when we expect to see the former president, Donald Trump, first answer these criminal charges. I want to bring in Catherine Faulders for that. A time and place on Thursday has now been set, Catherine?
Yeah, we know that special counsel Jack Smith has asked the former president to appear right here at this courthouse Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern for an initial appearance to be arraigned on these new charges, these 4 counts that you mentioned. Now, this is federal court. There are no cameras allowed in court. It's quite possible that he could remain completely out of view when he comes here. But again, we're told Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, the former president will be here. He's likely to be accompanied by 2 of his lawyers, those same lawyers who met with special counsel Jack Smith last week to make the case that he shouldn't be indicted, Todd Blanche and John Lauro, who is said to be leading the legal efforts on January 6th. So Thursday, 4 p.m., the former president is expected to be right here in this courthouse.
Catherine Faulders and our team here with us today. Catherine, our thanks to you. Again, we're keeping our eyes trained on this room. The moment Jack Smith comes before the microphone there, we'll let you hear what he has to say about this federal criminal indictment. Again, much more serious, the most serious federal criminal indictment ever faced by a former American president in this country. Again, 4 counts that include obstructing official proceedings, trying to overturn the 2020 election, deprivation of rights, voting rights across this country, that every vote be counted and valued in so many words. We're going to bring in John Santucci, who has covered Donald Trump for years. And John, along the way, what has Donald Trump's defense been to this notion that he knew that he had lost the election?
Well, David, I can tell you from speaking to people that have been around the former president over just the last couple of weeks and after news of that Target letter, Trump was telling people, I never thought I lost the election. I never believed that. And some people, David, in conversations with the former president, I'm told face to face, actually pushed back on him and said, well, you were told this in real time. You were told that this wasn't true. And the former president maintaining, well, I never believed that. I always believed that I had won. And David, the biggest reaction I have to tell you I'm getting in real time from people reading this indictment along with us right now is one person wrote very strikingly, David, I wish he listened to the good people, wish he listened to the guardrails that were around him at the White House. And another person writing, if he listened to the actual lawyers, and as John Carl pointed out, it's those unindicted cited co-conspirators, several of them which are attorneys that were giving Trump this advice about fake electors. And as we've reported here on ABC, much at the time at the end of the Trump administration, those tense meetings that were playing out in the Oval Office, the screaming matches that often occurred between people that were White House employees, many of whom were attorneys, trying to shoot down these other attorneys that were coming in and around Donald Trump, pitching him on this idea of fake electors. Fast forward now, David, to where we are. Trump listening to those people, engaging in those conversations, clearly has gotten him yet into another indictment, David.
But, John, thank you. Is that a defense, though, Dan, that I never thought I lost, and so what if I listen to the bad actors? If you go off of John Santucci's words, there are many who were very close to the president saying now, I wish he had listened to the good ones.
Right.
Can he come out and say, well, I listened to the wrong ones?
Yeah, I mean, it can come out. It may not be a winning defense, but I think it's if this actually becomes a legal defense as opposed to a political one, that is exactly the sort of defense that he would wage. He would say that I had lawyers telling me that we could challenge on January 6th. I had people in these various states who were eyewitnesses, who'd seen things happen, et cetera. The problem for him, I think, will be on some of the statistics that he was providing, right? Where was he coming up with the numbers, for example, of 205,000 or whatever, X number of dead people voted? Now, my guess is he'll be able to link it back to somebody, right? I presume he didn't just pick numbers out of thin air, that somebody said to him, well, we think that there could be an argument of up to X thousand numbers of dead people who voted, et cetera. It's a defense. It may not be a winning one because of the number of people who were telling him it's not true.
And isn't there an expectation when you're the president of the United States that you have access to the...
Right.
Okay, we'll track. Okay, buddy.
And,
We should kill
Ms.
Pierre
Maggie-
Thomas's microphone, please, guys. I can hear him getting ready for world news while we're on the air during this special report, which we appreciate from Pierre, always working hard. But again,
right? It can't be unreasonable. Meaning, that's part of what they're going to look at here. Would it be remotely reasonable for him to believe it? And you hear John Santucci saying it's not just that he says he believed it then. He's saying he believes it now. To this day, he believes that the election was stolen from him. So, that's a defense. I'm not saying it's a winning one, but it's a defense.
we're waiting Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case, expected to brief not only reporters in that room, but the nation. He knows the nation is watching. And of course, as we have seen from Jack Smith before, he's fully aware that this is a polarized country. People believe what they believe already when it comes to January 6th and the election. Much of that because whether they supported the former president or not, they believed or did not believe what was coming not only from the president, but again, this group that surrounded the president during those crucial weeks from the election straight through January as laid out in this 45-page indictment. Our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, sitting here with me as well. First of all, Mary, anything from the White House?
The White House isn't commenting on the specifics. That is no surprise, but they do refer us to the Justice Department and a state spokesman saying they refer to the Justice Department, which conducts its investigation independently. And that is something that I suspect you're going to hear Jack Smith stress once again as well. This White House has gone out of its way in recent weeks to underscore the independence of the judiciary. It is why you are not seeing President Biden comment on this. He is well aware how Donald Trump is trying to spin this, how Republicans are arguing that President Biden, they claim, is simply trying to persecute his political rival here. And so the president has stressed he hasn't told the Justice Department what to pursue. He hasn't tried to influence what charges they bring. We should say, though, while Joe Biden has been silent on these indictments, he has been very outspoken in the past about Donald Trump and January 6th. He has accused him of spreading a web of lies about the 2020 election. He has said he valued power over principle, saying that his bruised ego mattered more to him than our democracy. And he has been very clear that January 6th and the attack on the Capitol is really a major theme of his reelection campaign, right? That's the first clip of video that you see in that reelection video that President Biden put out. And David, we know that the president feels very strongly that those who are responsible for this have to be held accountable. President Biden telling you that accountability is necessary no matter where it goes, even if it extends to the former president.
And we knew exactly what he meant when we asked that question of the president. In the meantime, Merrick Garland, the attorney general, took this step of naming a special counsel because the former president announced to the country that he was running for re-election. And that is when Merrick Garland said, this is underway. we have to get as far away from this as possible and naming a special counsel.
And they thought that that would put some distance, right, between these and prevent some of these political attacks. That has not happened, of course. This has now become the centerpiece, the cornerstone of Donald Trump's reelection campaign. In fact, he's already fundraising off of the news that we learned, just moments ago. And we know from the polling, the fact that none of these indictments, none of these charges so far have made a dent in Donald Trump's support. In fact, quite the opposite. He has a commanding, crushing lead in the polls. And it is just astounding when you take a step back and you think about the fact that the overwhelming frontrunner for the Republican nomination right now is someone who today is being accused of using his power to try and overturn the 2020 election, even though he knew allegedly that he had lost.
Let's just dive into this a bit further as we await Jack Smith. We're joined on the phone now by a reporter out on the campaign trail, Rachel Scott, who's been covering this for many months as well. And as you heard Mary allude to here moments ago, Rachel, Donald Trump has not only campaigned off of the first federal criminal indictment, now the second one as we sit here today, arguably much more serious than even the first. He has campaigned off of it. And he has built his lead, a much more commanding lead than just several weeks back on the Republican side. The closest candidate behind him, Ron DeSantis, now trailing in many cases by up to 40 points or so.
David, make no mistake about it. Trump's legal defense is now the cornerstone of his campaign. I was just out on the campaign trail with him in Iowa and Pennsylvania. He was talking about railing against these indictments on the campaign trail to voters, and his rivals are hesitant to go after him. You mentioned Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He's his biggest challenger so far. I asked him a few weeks ago if the former president bears any responsibility for what happened on January 6th. He said that Trump could have acted more forcefully that day, but he also believes that the Justice Department is being weaponized. Even Trump's own former Vice President, Mike Pence, who called his actions reckless on January 6th, he told you that he felt like the former president not only put his life in danger, but his family's life in danger. He said that he hoped that Trump would not be indicted again. So what we were seeing out on the campaign trail is all of these candidates continue to walk a very fine line when it comes to the former president, because there's a clear concern here that they're going to turn away the very voters that they need in order to win the Republican nomination, David.
Rachel Scott with us here. Rachel, thank you on this gulf now between Donald Trump and all of the other Republican candidates, leading Ron DeSantis by about 37 points on the Republican side. And again, just today, the New York Times Siena poll that looked at the entire general election matchup, if it were held today between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, a dead heat in this country, 43-43, obviously with full knowledge of the first federal criminal indictment. These numbers obviously don't take into account the news as it's unfolding here today. And also, a big part of this story in the New York Times reporting today are the number of people who are disinterested in both candidates and who did not want to say they would really vote for either one. A deep dive goes into their feelings about both of these candidates and how strongly they feel. But again, right now in this country, as you see, this is not Jack Smith. We've been given a 2-minute warning, which is something they often do. They check the microphone and let reporters know. Let's bring in Aaron Katersky really quickly, who's pouring through the indictment as well. This is a relationship that we have reported on in great detail here on World News Tonight, that between the former president and Mike Pence, and there's a point in the indictment where it's clear that the former president has told Mike Pence, "You're too honest."
It's a stunning moment when former President Trump called the vice president and berated him, David, the indictment says, because he learned that Pence had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that at the certification, the vice president had the authority to reject what was going on Capitol Hill. Pence, we know, has said he did not have that authority, disagreed with President Trump, was berated for it, the special counsel says. Trump telling him, "You're too honest." And while this is not called out for a specific criminal charge, that it is even part of the whole tally of criminal charges is really quite stunning. And of course, we know the calls that echoed here on Capitol Hill on January 6th, hang Mike Pence.
Aaron Katursky live in Washington for us, our investigative reporter. Aaron, thank you. We do have breaking news coming in right now as we await Jack Smith, the special counsel. ABC News has just learned that former President Trump's case has been assigned now to D.C. District Judge Tanya Chutkan. According to the court docket, Chutkan is an appointee of former President Obama. She has previously been profiled for handing out some of the most severe sentences for rioters involved in the January 6th assault on the Capitol. She also previously rejected an effort by Donald Trump to try to block the release of documents to the House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol riot. This is interesting, and I had asked Dan before we came on the air today how judges are selected. We know it's at random. In some cases, they're selected by a wheel, but we believe there's some sort of automated system that selects these judges.
Correct. So all of the judges in the D.C. circuit, and I think there are about 13 full-time, and then there are a bunch who are senior judges.
Yeah.
Can go into effectively what's a random wheel. And they get picked randomly in terms of who the judge becomes. We talked about this before. There are 4 of the 13 were nominated by Republicans, 9 nominated by Democrats. Now, the judge's role here becomes critical in timing.
We'll talk more about the judge in just a moment. First, Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case. This is the second time now coming before the American people. Let's listen.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other co-conspirators?
We'll keep the microphone open there for questions from reporters, though not a surprise that Jack Smith is not answering any of those questions as he leaves the podium. He was very short in addressing the American people, again, inviting American voters across this country to read this 45-page indictment. As he did last time, he said the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty. But he did start by saying this was a defendant who was fueled by lies, and he spread those lies across the nation. It heavily affected this nation's process for collecting and counting votes in America. He talked about the men and women who were defending the Capitol on January 6th. He called them heroes. in his words. He said, we will seek a speedy trial with a fair jury. And that brings up the question, Dan Abrams, for those watching at home, how this could potentially, and none of us really know the full answer to this, affect the presidential election on its way. But is there a scenario where both of these cases are tried and finished before the election?
There's a scenario, absolutely. I think it's unlikely, but there's a scenario. Look, in a typical case, I would tell you, wait, you're talking about November of 2024? And you're asking me, can they finish the case before then? The answer would be absolutely. Of course they can. When you're talking about this case, for example, in the documents case, it's already been pushed back to May of 2024. I expect that one will get delayed again for certain. Now, this judge is not a judge who is, going to be necessarily as sympathetic to some of the arguments as Aileen Cannon may have been. This is a district that tends to move these kinds of cases certainly more quickly than that. But there will be arguments by the Trump team to try to delay this, to try to push it back as much as possible. You're going to hear, and you just heard Jack Smith say he's going to pursue a speedy trial. But that's really a right that belongs to the defendant, not the prosecutor. It's the defendant's right to a speedy trial. So it's the defendant that tends to have a lot of power and control over how fast a case moves. But this is where the judge becomes critical. Yes, there are going to be questions of admissibility of evidence, et cetera. But in a case where this political campaign and the legal case intersect, the most important power this judge is going to have is, does the trial happen before the election or not? And we'll just have to see what happens with that.
And it's not just this judge. We looked into this before we came on the air as well. Just about every judge, if not every judge in the district, has presided over one of these January 6th related trials.
Right. And even the Trump-appointed judges have not been soft on the January 6th rioters. I mean, best case scenario, there was one judge who dismissed a particular charge, actually one of the charges that's charged here. But it's different because in that case, the question was, did the person have corrupt motive? Meaning, were they doing it knowing that what they were doing was illegal and wrong? Well, here the whole document is an explanation of why Donald Trump knew what he was doing was corrupt and wrong. So even if there's a higher standard established for one of these crimes, if you believe Donald Trump is guilty, they've laid out an explanation for why that issue wouldn't apply. So my broader point is, Trump judges, Obama judges, Bush judges, whatever the case may be, these are still going to be some difficult legal arguments for the Trump team to win.
And many of these judges have handed down very serious sentences for people related to January 6th. I want to bring in Asha Rangappa, law professor, Yale Law School, former special agent, New York FBI. And Asha, one of the questions from many people in this country for so long has been in watching all of these January 6th cases as they played out in Washington, D.C., whether or not the people at the very top would be prosecuted as well. And now, not only do we have this case, we know it will play out in Washington and in front of a judge who has presided over some of these very cases before.
Yes, well, 3 of the counts here are conspiracy charges. And a conspiracy is an agreement to commit a crime. So what Jack Smith has been able to do is to pierce this cone of silence that Donald Trump has always been able to create around him, where he's able to have intermediaries, lawyers, people that he has conversations with and then will, do much of the work. He's been able to pierce that inner circle, and we have evidence in this indictment of actual conversations, actual communications that really connect Trump to that agreement to use deceptive means to block this election. That's pretty extraordinary. I also think that this indictment is significant in that Jack Smith was able to bring in depictions, evidence of the violence that unfolded on January 6th. This is a spectacle that everyone remembers from watching it unfold on television. And this was a very tricky area. You mentioned that he wasn't charged with insurrection. That would have encountered a lot of First Amendment issues because it would have been based on Trump's speech. But he was able to bring this in by using the charge of deprivation of rights, that what Trump was trying to do is prevent these people from getting their votes counted using intimidation and violence. So this is a very clever charges and straightforward charges that will ideally be streamlined since he's only named Donald Trump as of right now as the defendant.
Asha Rangappa with us here. Asha, thank you for your perspective as always. And she makes a very good point about avoiding insurrection charges or charges connected to that because of constitutional defense of free speech in this country, John. But Jack Smith does talk about what Donald Trump was doing as this was playing out in the Capitol, and instead of trying to halt it, allowing it to proceed.
If you remember, when he was impeached on this, he was impeached for inciting the riot. That's not what's going on here. But Jack Smith makes the allegation that Trump tried to exploit the riot to achieve his overall goal, which is disrupting the proceeding to certify the election. He says directly, on the evening of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator Warren attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud to delay the certification. And this is pretty amazing. He calls 2 senators directly. Co-conspirator number 1 calls 6 members of Congress.
John Carl with us. We know that John Santucci, our reporter who has covered Trump for many years, has now talked to the former president. John, what's his reaction at this hour?
David, I just hung up the phone with former President Trump. He seemed rather relaxed, David, said that he has read through the indictments, that he's been on the phone. David, the words he used in speaking to me, he said it's pile on from special counsel Jack Smith. More charges. I asked him, David, did you expect this? Were you prepared for this? And he said, again, it's election interference. It's another effort by the Democrats. This is Donald Trump, David, to ABC News. Another effort by the Democrats to attack the 2024 election. And he said, David, that it's just going to keep going on. And I questioned him on that. And I said, what does that mean, Mr. President? And he said, just more charges, more charges. He then maintained, David, that he believes he is leading in the polls and that he is going to go on to, again, this is former President Trump, he believes that he will defeat Joe Biden. I then said, what's your overall word for everything that has been the last couple months with these indictments, David? Donald Trump telling me ridiculous.
I do want to ask you, John, though, because you were on the air with us just about a week ago when the target letter was made public. And at the time, our team was reporting that Donald Trump's legal team was somewhat surprised by that target letter, that they thought that perhaps they would be able to avoid this particular federal criminal indictment, that the classified documents case would move forward, but that this was one that they thought perhaps they would get by.
Yeah, David, and I had heard that in real time, too. And Donald Trump, I'm told, at that time, that's 2 Sundays ago, David, was stunned by it. And at this rate, David, I think Donald Trump, from what I hear and from just speaking to him right now, his voice sounded like someone almost resigned to it. I've spoken to the former president, as you know, David, many times over nearly 10 years of covering him now. Didn't sound angry, didn't sound excited, sounded as if he was just sitting back and swiped the phone and answered when we just spoke a moment ago. But again, David, I think that the 2 words that just struck me in speaking to him just now, pile on. I think just from talking to aides around him and now speaking to the former president himself, it just seems like in Donald Trump's mind, this was just another day.
And that will be part of the political message, surely, in moving forward. One more question for you, John, and it's on a related note, because he's been on, obviously, campaigning, been on the trail these last couple of days, answering questions, was on one radio show, was actually asked if going forward you get these indictments and you got a jury in D.C., this is the questioner asking, you get convicted and sentenced, does that stop your campaign for president if you're sentenced? The host asked him. He replied, not at all. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it could stop me. Not at all.
Yeah, and David, I think right there in his response to me when I just hung up with him, he seemed full steam ahead, maintaining again, talking about the polls, saying we're going to keep on going forward. And as Rachel Scott noted with you earlier, David, Donald Trump out on the campaign trail this weekend, again, hammering that fact. He's going to keep charging ahead, keep moving forward. And look, we don't even have to take Donald Trump's words for it. You mentioned earlier that New York Times Siena poll, it just came out in the last couple of days. He is doing well at the moment, David, but obviously another indictment is something that Donald Trump and his aides don't take lightly.
Well, and they shouldn't. It's an extraordinary moment in American history, and we shouldn't gloss over it for sure. John Santucci, our thanks to you. I want to bring in our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who was there at the Capitol on January 6th. And Martha, you could hear really in Jack Smith's voice there as he presented his short statement to the American people, the weight of this, though trying to distance himself from the politics of it all, say presumed innocent until proven guilty, but asked the American people to read this.
And to remember January 6th, and saying that the men and women in law enforcement were heroes that day, and indeed they were. And what the American people also need to think about is the effect that day had on them. You've talked to them before, David, and interviewed them, and the wounds, the injuries, the looking back on that day, they will never be the same. And that day for me, up on the Hill and talking to people who said they were there because Donald Trump wanted them to, quote, stop the steal. That was the whole idea of the speech that Donald Trump gave that day. It was a rally. He told people to go to Capitol Hill. And his closing words again, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. We're going to try and give the Republicans the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. At the time, the Secret Service knew there were armed men in the crowd. I interviewed people in tactical gear, and I saw them communicate with one another on Capitol Hill. It's a day we should all remember, David.
Martha Raddatz talking about that day. Jack Smith talking about it as well moments ago, saying that the chaos around this country involving, Martha, thank you, involving the election and those weeks leading up to January 6th was fueled by lies from the defendant. And of course, the defendant he was speaking of was former President Donald Trump, who at this hour, you're watching ABC News Live coverage, has been charged with 4 counts. This is the second federal criminal indictment of the former president. Conspiracy to defraud the U.S., conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent.
Again, this case is one that the Justice Department will probably consider one of the biggest and most important cases in its history. Indicting a former sitting president who's now running for office is not something that they ran to do. The Attorney General was very methodical in the approach, but this special counsel, again, David, the most aggressive prosecutor I've seen in 20 years of covering the Justice Department.
And again, Jack Smith saying he invites the American people to read this 45-page indictment. A former American president now charged with obstruction and conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and again, conspiracy against rights. And of course, those rights allude to votes in this country being counted in the way they were intended. For many of you here in the East, World News Tonight begins in just about 5 seconds. I'm David Muir. I'll see you for World News.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
From ABC News World Headquarters.